Welcome again to Tabletop History. Today we're going to take a look at one of the most influential and successful Euro games of all time, Settlers of Catan. Thankfully, because of Settlers of Catan, every time a group of friends get together to play a board game, we aren't stuck playing Monopoly for the next 3 hours, or 4, or 5. Settlers of Catan is one of the few games that both hardcore gamers and casual gamers can agree upon. And because of that, we all need to take a look at the story of Settlers of Catan. Klaus Tuber was a dental technician from Rossdorf, Germany. His father had owned the business before him, so he grew up knowing that one day he would take over. Like all young men from Germany, he was required to do 2 years of military service after he got out of high school. When he finished his time in the military, he went to university, and by the time he graduated, he was married with a family. So, in 1978, at age 26, he felt it was time he come home to apprentice under his father and make the family business his own. The idea of a career of making board games was nowhere in his mind, but the hours spent in a dental lab were long. He felt he was working all the time and needed something to help keep him sane, a hobby of some sort. As a child, he had enjoyed playing board games. He thought maybe playing a board game with some friends would be a good way to take his mind off his job. By this time, in the early 1980s, board games were becoming a very important cultural pastime in West Germany. Game playing was everywhere, and that was pushing the level of quality. There were monthly board game magazines. The newspapers in Germany would review new board games, and in 1983, Essen began hosting one of the world's first board game conventions. We take some of this for granted now, but at the time, innovations in board game play were in their infancy. We've seen this play out many times in many industries. The more the audience sees, experiences, or plays of that medium, the higher the expectations. Audiences went crazy for a film that is simply a train coming toward the camera. At the time, that was groundbreaking. Now, not so much. In Germany, the expectations grew, and designers had to challenge themselves in order to be successful. At the Board Game Expo in Essen, the Spiel des Jahres Award was created to declare each year's best game. It quickly became apparent that winning this award could be very important to a game's market potential. A typical game in Germany could sell 10,000 copies a year. But winning the award might mean you could sell 100 or maybe even 200,000 copies. This brings us back to Klaus. He was actively involved in game playing, and he would play with his friends every week. But after a while, playing games just wasn't enough. He started imagining stories in his head, and imagining what a game about that story would look like. In 1981, at one of his weekly game nights, he unveiled to his friends a new game, one that he had designed himself. The game is what would end up becoming Barbarossa. At the time, he had been reading The Riddle Master by Patricia McKillip. The book is about a man who is forced to answer many riddles from a ghost. He was enjoying reading the book so much, he wanted to find a way to bring that experience to life. His friends enjoyed the game. Klaus asked them questions, trying to find out how he could improve the gameplay. And he continued to work on it. On weekends, Klaus would use his family time to test this and other board games that he was designing. His family would play his board games over and over, and he would watch how they reacted to certain parts of the gameplay. Tuber said that he would put a picture book near his young son before they started a game. If he grabbed the book during gameplay, then he knew that the game wasn't holding his son's attention, and it needed work. When he started creating games, he said, "I really started enjoying playing board games when I was around 20 or 21. I had to deal with a lot of frustration and stress as the manager of a dental lab. The frustration caused me to retreat a bit into my own world. Over the years, I started developing these games. Without any thought of marketing them, it was a pure escape and amusement, a hobby. After several years of playing games created by Klaus, his friends urged him to try and get his games published. Klaus was unsure. The games were simply an exercise for him, and a way to spend time with his growing kids. However, he finally relented. He would take his game, which was now a fully realized Barbarossa, to a publisher, just to see if maybe they were interested. And they were. They thought Barbarossa was original, and it probably could gain some attention from players at Essen. And if the word of mouth was good, it might be a decent seller. Not only did it take Essen by storm, it ended up taking the Spiel des Jahres award for the Game of the Year. Not bad for a first-time designer. Alexia learned to read. But in Germany, it was common for a game to have a great single year and then see dramatic sales decreases as people moved on to the next game. Klaus didn't feel that board game design was anything more than an opportunity for a little side income. He continued to work in his dental lab even as he created and sold new games. Klaus began reading about Viking mythology. He found the expeditions for new countries and colonizing to be really fascinating. And it occurred to him, what if I made a board game that will allow you to settle a territory? Build a settlement, then move on and build another settlement. Then use the resources that you get from your settlement to continue your expansion. His family grew to know the game well. As with his other games, they were his primary playtesters every weekend. Klaus felt it had potential, but the square spaces seemed to not be working quite right. It just wasn't balancing correctly. And his first prototypes for this game were just too complex. He had a fear that people would give up before they learned the game. He continued to work on the game for over 3 years, trying to balance the length of playing time, turn mechanics, and board structure. He finally felt he had a breakthrough. Use hexagon tiles in place of the square tiles that had been on his prototypes. This seemed to make the board much easier to navigate. Now, Klaus thought the game was ready. It wasn't overly long or complicated, and the gameplay kept all players engaged during each person's turn. Instead of having to wait through 3 other people to roll dice and make decisions before you can get a chance at making any progress, all players must remain tuned in during an opponent's move, because they could benefit in resources during each roll of the dice. Klaus felt that this was important. There was no time for going to the kitchen for a snack between turns. When Klaus brought his new prototype, a game called Settlers of Catan, to his publisher, they were ecstatic. It very well could be a sleeper hit of the convention. And they were right. Settlers of Catan won the Spiel des Jahres in 1995, signifying that Catan was the top game of the year. Klaus did not know if this was going to be any different from his previous games, which had sold well initially and then tapered off as people began playing other things. In Germany, over the next few years, it did start to taper down a little bit. But there was something different that happened with this game. Something that hadn't happened with his previous games. It began getting some attention across the pond in America. Now, there is a debate on if Settlers of Catan is responsible for introducing Americans to Euro games, or if the Euro-style games were already finding an audience in American board game circles right as Settlers of Catan was being released. I don't know. What I do know is that if Settlers of Catan wasn't such an enjoyable Euro game, I don't know if people would have sought out other Euro games to play. And I'm sure it helped that there was a new website being launched called BoardGameGeek.com, which allowed many people to connect with other Settlers of Catan players and find similar Euro games that they might also enjoy. Catan was the it game at the beginning of BGG.com. Most American games are more of a winner-take-all, crushing the opponent's style of game. But Euro games, especially those from Germany, had more strategy and a lot of evenness right until near the end. Catan was a breath of fresh air, unlike anything many American gamers had played, and this was definitely to its benefit. By winning the Spiel des Jahres, it made American game companies take notice. Mayfair Games, a small publisher that specialized in importing foreign games, thought this could be worth adding to their catalog. When it was released stateside, Settlers of Catan wasn't an immediate smash. Most people couldn't even pronounce Spiel des Jahres. I admit I still struggle with it myself. Eurogames weren't on most store shelves, and Catan didn't benefit from a massive media campaign with TV commercials and celebrity spokespersons. In fact, you could say that the initial release was somewhat rocky. The game was released in the US in 1996. At that time, Eurogames rarely made a dent. The major toy companies had a hold on the majority of the game market. Board game enthusiasts were playing a lot of war games and role-playing games. Catan had one thing going for it. The few people who played it really liked it, and many of them took it to introduce to their friends. Let's back up and see where this little company called Mayfair Games actually started. The small company started in Chicago and opened in 1981. The first games in their catalog were Empire Builder and the Dungeons & Dragons role-player supplement called Roll-Aids. The main core of the brand was railroad games and translations of European games for the American market. Settlers of Catan was one of the games released by the company during their 1996 rollout. Then, in November of that year, Mayfair laid off 2/3 of their workforce. Catan had sold reasonably well, but Mayfair had many other financial issues going on that one game couldn't overcome. The company was set to completely close in February of 1997. Possibly that could be a major setback for Settlers of Catan. Having a property sold off and re-implemented by a new publisher can be tricky. Catan's assets could be sold to another company that wouldn't care to publish the game at all, and it could be destined to sit on the shelf for many years. However, another game company, Iron Crown Enterprises, came in at the last second and saved the brand from bankruptcy. Iron Crown, also known as ICE, was known mainly for role-playing games, so they didn't completely merge the two brands as often happens. They took stock in the company and kept it as a separate entity. ICE's president, Pete Finland, moved over to become president of Mayfair, initially only staying for a couple of years before departing, and then came back full-time to Mayfair in 2007. Interestingly, shortly after bailing out Mayfair, ICE began experiencing financial issues and filed for bankruptcy themselves in 2000. At that time, they lost a number of their game properties in bankruptcy court. The ICE intellectual property now pretty much only exists as a holding company for some of the more famous role-playing games that they produced. Mayfair Games, on the other hand, continued to appeal to gamers and hobbyists, and Catan was continuing to grow by word of mouth, becoming one of the core games many people at gaming conventions were playing and then bringing home and introducing to their friends. I myself was one of these people. A group of friends pulled this game out, and I'm embarrassed to admit I thought it looked kind of dumb at first. But they said just play it once, give it a chance, you'll like it. And they were right, I was hooked. When Pete Finland returned to Mayfair in 2007, he recognized that Catan was a property that was really growing. They needed to cultivate it, and if they did so, they might have a mainstream hit on their hands. So in 2007, they rebranded the game, giving the box and components a little bit of a facelift. They wanted the game to look as appealing to the masses as possible. Around 2010, the Catan snowball was rolling pretty forcefully and beginning to take hold in mainstream culture. It wasn't just for gaming conventions and specialty stores. Catan began popping up on quote-unquote regular store shelves. Now, a few years later, you can go to any Walmart or Target and find the game. There were online articles from several well-known news services taking note of this game's rising popularity. Wired called it the potential monopoly killer, and the Washington Post wondered if it was the monopoly for our time. I find these interesting comparisons. To a gaming enthusiast, the two games and their gameplay couldn't have less in common. One is fun, and the other, as you know, well, I'll stop there. With newspaper and magazine writers taking notice, Settlers of Catan was really selling. Monopoly-level success in accomplishment and performance was the only thing that mainstream magazines and newspapers could reference and compare it to. As Robert Carty, the VP of marketing from Mayfair Games, understood, you can only sell to the board game enthusiast crowd for so long. There are only so many people. To keep a game selling, you have to break out to the casual game players eventually. I'd say when Parks and Recreation used a whole episode to talk about Settlers of Catan, I'm pretty sure at that point it was in the public consciousness. Klaus Tuber's little game was now one of the major players in the tabletop world. Catan has sold over 20 million copies, and all seem to be running smoothly. Then, in 2016, Mayfair Games announced that they had sold the rights to Catan to Asmodee Games, and they would create a special holding company specifically for Settlers of Catan. Catan's artwork again was updated, and now you can pretty much find Catan on any department store shelf. As for Mayfair the company, instead of having to use the majority of their resources to publish Catan, they felt that they could get back into cultivating small European games for the American market. Sadly, in 2018 they announced they would be shutting their doors and Asmodee would take over their intellectual property as well. Klaus Tuber continued to work in his dental lab until the early 2000s, thinking that this game design was still just a side project. But he was finally able to become a full-time game designer 20 years after he initially brought his homemade game to his weekly game night. Catan shows no signs of slowing down, with expansions and licensed games, as well as new people continuing to discover the original game. You won't find many game nights where someone doesn't suggest playing Settlers of Catan. One can only hope that it actually is becoming the Monopoly killer. This has been Tabletop History. Thanks for watching.